First of all, rude. Second of all, yeah, sure, I get it. And welcome to another episode of SnarkSquad Pod, the media podcast where love conquers all. I am Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marines.
And joining us today is our good friend of the pod, Sam. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Sam, and I run the BookTube channel Thoughts on Tomes, where I discuss everything book-related, book reviews, book chats, stuff like that, as it suggests on the tin. And you can also find me on basically any social media platform with the same name, Thoughts on Tomes. And I'm also the co-creator of BookNet Fest with Mari. Woo! And that is a book festival that's centered around the online book community. And for anyone that creates or consumes content that is bookish related online. So we have our next event, our second year, coming up in 2018 in September. So all the information about that is at booknetfest.com.
So today we are doing another non-media specific type episode. We are talking about adaptations today. I guess normally this is where we would do some sort of explanation of what the thing is. But I feel like this is pretty self-explanatory, you know. There's a thing and then it's adapted into another thing. Wow.
Well done.
You're welcome. You're welcome for that beautiful explanation. So since there's not really any need to do an overview of the thing, I think the best place to get started then might be with a broad strokes look at what kind of works and doesn't work in adaptations. So what are things that you are looking to experience in an adaptation? What are the things that you think make an adaptation particularly strong or effective?
I think that for me, it changes for an adaptation of material that I am very invested in. And I know that that's probably not a super media educated answer, but for
it's a very human answer.
It is a very human answer. But media that I love, I think that I feel I want it to be more faithful in the adaptation. And I know that we will probably get into this, but I also know that is probably not a measure of a good or bad adaptation, whether it's faithful to the source material. That probably is not a measure. But for me personally, when I'm going into something that has been adapted from material I love, I want it to be faithful, at least in spirit, to the thing that I originally fell in love with. So that's my very human answer. But apart from that, I think that I want an adaptation to be mindful of the medium that it is changing to. So if it's going, yes. I think the most common adaptation, or probably the one that I experienced the most, is book to movie. And those are two very, very different mediums. And I think that I'm most looking for the new medium to be able to capture the story and the feel and to tell a valid story in the new medium, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
I also don't have a super scientific media savvy answer, but basically I am looking for it to have the same emotional impact on me as the original material. Like Madi was saying, and I agree with so much of what she was saying, I just want it to feel like the original story, even if it's not necessarily following those same story beats. I have found that as we get more and more adaptations happening, that I am able to kind of separate the original book material from the movie or TV show that it's being adapted into, and I give it a little more leeway. Obviously, that's going to change depending on how invested I am, and if some of my favorites were being adapted, like if The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern got adapted, it better be exact. But otherwise, I am able to kind of separate and say these are two different things, as long as there's certain elements that stay at least reminiscent of the original material. For example, characters is what I look at more than anything else. I feel like the plot can change its beats a little bit more for me, and I can forgive that depending on the medium that it's in and how much flexibility you have there, because I get that sometimes you can't go into all those little side details and stuff that you would get in the book in a movie, for example. but I want the characters to still feel the same. I want them to be making decisions, even if they aren't the same decisions made in the book. I want them to make decisions that feel like decisions that the characters would have made. So it still feels like I'm getting to experience this story with the same characters that I had from the original material.
Yeah, I think so. Two things. What you just said kind of reminded me of something that I was thinking about like before coming to have this conversation about fan fiction, is that you see there's something that you see in fan fiction where with like AU fan fiction that I feel like the most effective. It's been a really long time since I was like big into fan fiction, but so this is a really, really uneducated place for me to be starting. But I feel like the most effective AU fan fiction tends to concentrate on really building out those characters, whereas when fanfiction authors get too caught up in like hitting plot beat for plot beat, but like in a different world, you start to mangle the characters a little bit, I think. And I think you see some of that too when making adaptations. I think that like movie adaptations of books, sometimes like there are certain changes that you have to make, especially if you're taking like a 500-page book and turning it into a movie with a runtime of under 2 hours. Like you're not going to be able to hit every single one of those plot beats. And so picking some sort of like emotional core of everything that you're talking about is kind of necessary in order to, I think, to hit like that same emotional resonance from the original and to like really to capture that in a movie, as opposed to just trying to say, okay, well, A, B, C, D, like these are things that happened in the story and we have to make all of them happen. Like you're just not, like you can't do that when you're going from those two different mediums. I think something that Mari said about how you have to like be mindful of the media that you're translating into. The first thing that came to mind when you said that was Hunger Games. And I feel like the first movie in particular is very effective at being a new thing. Like it's very clearly the same story, but like the first Hunger Games book is a YA novel, is a first person YA novel, and it is told, very much that way, and it's very much about being in Katniss's head and whatnot. So if you're taking that story and you're turning it into a movie, like obviously you have to flatten a certain number of plot elements as well, just for the sake of time. But also, like, you suddenly have this new opportunity because the story cannot be a like close to first. I guess I shouldn't say cannot be. There are ways. There are definitely ways that you could have made a movie version that was still a like very close first person experience of it. But it was smartly not that. And I think taking the opportunity to say, okay, if we're no longer in Katniss's head, then what does that mean about the way that we set up this story? And like giving us the view of like the game master and that whole setup was for me at least, a very effective way of translating from one medium to another.
I think that a good adaptation has to look at the source material and make some choices about what they find important in that material and then go from there. And I think that it gets complicated because a good adaptation, we are either talking about if it's good in and of itself, kind of existing independently from the original work. Is it quality? Is it telling a full story? Does it measure up to our standards of good that we would apply to any other story? And then there's that idea of, is it good in the way that it adapted the material? And I think that idea of, is it good in the way that it adapted the material is so subjective, because you have people who are looking at the source material and making decisions about what's important. And it could be literally everything that you think was unimportant in that thing you fell in love with. And so they've now highlighted these things that they want to translate into a new medium. And, for people who experience the media in its original form, that it's so subjective that it's hard to say like that people do a good or bad job with that. So kind of tacking on to what you said about like fan fiction and AU, a lot of times an adaptation can just be, we were talking about Riverdale at the very beginning of this podcast and how it's kind of an adaptation, but only in that it took the characters and used them as an entry point into this completely different thing. And I think it did a great job with that, even though you could look at the original Archie comics and be like, this is totally different. This is nothing like what the original material is. But does that make it a bad adaptation? I don't know. That's kind of where it gets tricky.
Yeah, and when both of you guys were talking, I actually started thinking of Twilight, which is interesting because I think it's just like I'm on the show, therefore we have to discuss Twilight because it's SnarkSquad, association kind of thing. But I think that's what Sweeney was saying about just what is important and adapting something that is mostly in a person's head, a character's head. That was a lot of Twilight, and that first movie is so polarizing. I mean, the whole thing is polarizing. So, but like the first movie is so polarizing for people because everyone was expecting something based on their experience of Bella's head. And I think that didn't really translate in the first movie. And even though the movies are not the best things ever created, I think they did a good job of getting better as they went on, as being adaptations. So I think that they tried to stick so close to what was happening on the outside in that first film. And everyone was like, this is really boring because your whole time is spent in Bella's head and we're not getting any of these little tidbits. And Bella has no personality, even more so when you're outside of her head. So I think that whole franchise is an interesting thing to look at as far as how to kind of learn to adapt better, more properly, because they did get better with each film installment.
I'm really excited that you brought this up, and I'm like 100% convinced we invited the right person because let's talk about Twilight. I wrote in my notes that I wanted to bring Twilight up because I think it's a good example of what we've now been talking about how you can measure an adaptation, because I obviously, and you guys know, I hate the Twilight books, like passionately, from beginning to end. And I think that the Twilight movies are not good, but I think that they are good adaptations in that they improve over the books. Yeah. And I think that they improve over the books. Probably part of it is just because of the medium change. I think that when you're spending 1 to 2 hours with this versus 600 or 700 pages that we've now been reading Breaking Dawn, like, because it is a bad thing, it is now better. It's just less time.
Because you made it shorter.
Right. Yeah. We've shortened it. We've condensed it. And even looking at kind of like the first Twilight movie, they've even made some changes to try and add plot where Stephenie Meyer didn't. They had this whole like side thing about murders happening in Forks, and they're trying to use that to kind of carry the story along, which Stephenie Meyer didn't do. She didn't have any kind of like big, connecting plot thing. So the movie got to go in there, add that little thing in, and what a difference it made. Just to, even if it wasn't super interesting, it now has a plot that the book did not have. So I think that they're a really interesting look or take on an adaptation because I think they improve over the book, even though I hate both the books and the movies.
Yeah, I think that we're going to have a similar phenomenon kind of happen with the Shatter Me adaptation when that eventually gets released, because we've been hearing about it for forever. But when I was first hearing about it, I was excited because I like the Shatter Me series for the cotton candy that it is, but it has no world building whatsoever. And I think that it's a cool setting, and it could be a really cool setting. It has this almost like X-Men vibe to it, and it's not explored in the actual text really. I mean, very, very minutely. So I think that in the adaptation, they're going to have to go into that. And I think that's going to be much more interesting. You're going to have all these different compelling side characters that you just didn't have an opportunity to have. I think that's going to make some people mad because there's like not all Juliet and Warner all the time. But I think it's going to make it for a better, fleshed out story because you're going to have a world that had all this potential, and hopefully that potential will be reached within the adaptation. We will see.
I feel like I might enjoy the Shatter Me adaptation more than the book, just because my main problem with the book was that Tahira Mafi's writing is some of my least favorite I've ever read in my entire life.
Very flowery.
So the fact that it was, just beyond flowery. I love flowery writing. I'm all about the fairy tale and folklore and all of that. I love it. Give me purple prose any day. Her writing was ridiculous and totally ununderstandable, like just awful. So the fact that we're getting rid of her writing in a new medium, like I'm in. I'll watch that. I think that probably for you, Sweeney, that kind of phenomena will happen with A Wrinkle in Time.
That is literally what I was about to say. Yeah, I think that getting away from the writing, which is the whole reason that we are having this conversation about adaptations, is we thought it would be a fun thing to do in between our talk about A Wrinkle in Time the book and A Wrinkle in Time the movie when it comes out. I felt that way just reading the book. Was like, I still am super excited about this movie. I was not enjoying most of my reading experience of the book, again, because I felt like it was preaching at me constantly, and I didn't like that experience. That was very not fun for me, but I feel reasonably confident that that's not going to be my experience of watching this movie. And I feel like, yes, like removing the writing, basically, from the experience of the story and like just spending time with this in this story with these characters in these worlds, like that stuff, which was everything that worked for me about this book, and it was the writing that didn't work. So if we subtract the writing, I'm hopeful that I will have a pleasant experience with the movie.
My one thing like that I'm still hopeful for the adaptation, even though I did not have a good time with the source material, is Ready Player One, which is a book by Ernest Cline, which is getting adapted into a movie. I think it had a really interesting premise and an interesting world. I think there's still danger there because it did not treat its female characters great. And I think there is a little bit of like nerdy white guy wish fulfillment going on in that story. And it had some problems with kind of like a surprise twist that was really representation, quote unquote, which it's not if it's a surprise twist kind of deal. So there were a lot of problems with it, but I'm still hopeful because we won't get Ernest Cline's writing. We won't get, hopefully, as beat over the head with the like 80s nostalgia, just like listing things from the 80s to, impress you with my knowledge kind of deal. And so pulling that away from the story, that's my one thing that I'm like, okay, I didn't like the source material, but I'm hopeful for the adaptation.
Yeah, I don't know, that like listing things from the 80s, that can also go another way too. It like that they can lean into that as well in a bad way.
Stop.
Right. I don't know. I haven't read the book, but I just hearing you describe that, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm hopeful for you, but it's also that can go the other way.
True.
I think I was trying to think of a good way to articulate what about it worked for me, but I have not consumed either the book or the movie in such a long time. But when I was thinking of movie experiences that I enjoyed more than the book, Fight Club is a big one that comes to mind. And it's been so long now that it's hard for me to like actually articulate why. One thing, this is a very minor thing, but one thing that I do remember is the decision to change the sort of the big ending a little bit, that like the visuals of watching, spoiler for the end of this very old story now, whatever, way past spoiler warnings on this, but the changing the ending so that you have the sort of dramatic night visual of all the buildings coming down was, I think, a very smart choice. And I distinctly remember that is not the case in the book. And so there were a couple things like that where they made changes in order to achieve just more effective visuals, right? To say, okay, we're telling this story in a visual medium. So like, what are some fun and interesting things we can do visually? And I remember that being a thing that stands out to me about of reasons I enjoyed the movie more than the book.
And Fight Club is one of those movies that I have not read the book for Fight Club, so I cannot compare. But it is one of those movies and adaptations that has surpassed its source material, I believe. I mean, it's kind of one of those cult films now. And I don't believe that the book has that much of a following. So it's interesting when the adaptation surpasses the original text and becomes something even bigger than it originally was. And that's really the sign of kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of a good adaptation, because you can kind of view it as a separate thing and it's just as good, if not better, than the original.
Totally.
Talking about things that surpass their source material, I was looking at adaptations that I thought were good and reading about why they're maybe not good on the internet. Just to see what other people would say. And The Hunger Games is one that I think the entire thing did a very good job of adapting the source material. And they were movies that I also enjoyed. But people had issues with The Hunger Games, just apart from, you changed this thing or that thing, which I think is not a valid criticism. But for the first movie, especially, I think people said that it was too on the nose, actually, for the source material. That if you went to the movie and had read The Hunger Games, that you didn't really walk away with anything extra. And in fact, you walked away with less because there was less material. You didn't form the connections that you do in the book and that kind of idea. So I was thinking about adaptations that are too on the nose. And I can't say, and I know that this will not be true going forward, but part of the reason that I haven't read Game of Thrones, the first book in A Song of Ice and Fire, is that I tried 3 different times, and every single time the first few chapters were so directly taken from the first season, which I watched first, that I was just like, why am I going to read this? I already watched it. So it's too true to the material. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way for me to look at this too, is that there can be a point where you adapt it too closely. I don't know if you guys feel like that's a real thing.
I don't know that I feel like that's a real thing. I think that I feel like the point of I don't know. I guess I take that back. I can see how that's a real thing where you're adapting it too closely and you're not achieving anything worthwhile for the new medium is sort of the argument. I disagree with that argument in the case of The Hunger Games. I don't know, the idea that you should have come out of it with something new in order for that to be effective, to me rings false personally, but I don't know, to each their own, I guess. But in the case of Game of Thrones, I think that part of what is happening there for me personally is that there is a fair amount of world building that happens in the fantasy genre that I kind of don't care that much about. There's just a lot of stuff that feels so superfluous, and I'm just I don't know why we're spending time on this. I super don't give a shit. I just want this, I want the story to advance, and I'm not down with all the dawdling that happens in a lot of very long fantasy books. So conceptually, the idea of sticking very close while streamlining, which is sort of what happened with the first season of Game of Thrones, at least based on the very little of the first book that I have read so far. We're reading it for the podcast, just so you know. But I don't know. I don't know. Sam, maybe you have more thoughts about this.
I'm conflicted as well, because while Maddie was talking, I definitely had a feeling of I kind of remember feeling that, because I think I've maybe watched the first Hunger Games movie 2 times, once in theaters and once at home. But I've watched, for example, Catching Fire, which I think is the best one of the, 4 movies, numerous times, because I think it does a good job of sticking to what it's supposed to stick to, but also expanding. So I think there is this element of a successful adaptation expanding. I don't know if I agree necessarily on you're not gaining something from not expanding it. I feel like there are certain books that, since they are so beloved of mine, if, The Night Circus ever got adapted, I'd be like, you have to stick to it exactly. You can't change nothing. But otherwise,
we came for the circus.
Otherwise, it's I don't know if I necessarily feel that way. But I was thinking I was trying to think of adaptations that kind of feel too close. And I was having a hard time, because I feel like for the most part, they do stray. So you don't really have that happening very often. But I recently watched the very first episode of American Gods. And I just recently read American Gods over my Christmas holiday. So it was very fresh in my mind. And I did notice that although they do sort of expand on things in that series, it was very much you kind of have to have read the book to really kind of get what's going on. So that was kind of interesting for me. I know there's plenty of people that have watched the series that are I love the series, and I just think, so maybe it's just me knowing all the things. So I know kind of what's missing and what things aren't quite explained yet. And I only watched the first episode, so I'm sure things will get explained as it goes on. But it's so, the visuals in that are so extreme and out there, and there's so much it's all this mythology, and it's all this just high complex stuff kind of happening that's really confusing in the text anyway. But the text had some more explanation, and this just didn't quite. So I feel like it was sort of it was on the nose and not, now that I'm kind of talking about it. I mean, it was so, it was following certain scenes exactly, but I was feeling like I wasn't getting quite enough either at the same time. So that's kind of one of those adaptations that's kind of in the middle. But I do feel like it doesn't happen that often where it's so closely followed, because then we wouldn't get all these adaptation complaints because people get mad when it's not closely followed enough. So
right. I am going to do my obligatory once per podcast disagreement with something that I just said several minutes earlier.
I love this.
My position reversal. I have no specific examples of this. However, the more that I'm sitting here thinking about this idea of like, can you stick too closely? I am coming back around that maybe yes, you can, in part because like, what is the point of making it exist in another form if you are not going to do anything like unique or interesting or useful with it? Like, to me, the idea of a like super close, aggressively on the nose adaptation is almost just like, it's just like a weird form of, I don't know, like wish fulfillment. Like, I'm not like, why are, if a book or whatever, it's generally book to movie, but like the book exists. So what is the point of like a movie or a show? Or this is actually sort of the reason that I'm thinking this is that this is part of my issue with people who complain about adaptations because of minor changes, that like that want the adaptation to be kind of this pure and 100% complete reflection of their experience of consuming the original thing. And so there's an element to which something has to be at least somewhat different. Otherwise, like, I genuinely do not understand what the point is if you are not making any sort of changes in creating an adaptation. So I don't know.
Now that I brought this up, and I wasn't really sure kind of where I was going, but we've talked about it enough that I have a point.
Okay, great.
With the Hunger Games, I vividly remember I had read the books before and I really enjoyed them. And I remember when the movie was coming out, like I was nervous, like you usually are when you're a fan of something and it's being adapted and you want other people to love it. So I was a little bit nervous, and I think we even went to like a midnight showing, and that's how excited I was for this. And coming out of it, I enjoyed it, but I was worried that other people wouldn't because they did not get the fullness of Katniss's time in the Hunger Games and her relationships with other people. I think things were played so quickly with Rue, with, Peeta, and with Gale that you didn't get and that's what it is to be adapted, so for something to be adapted into a movie. So I think the real complaint when something is adapted too closely is that you did not take into consideration the change of medium and adjust accordingly. So, Hunger Games ticked off all these boxes of this happens, this happens, this happens, which is great, but you have so much less space to tell that story, and you didn't work around that. And we've talked a couple times now on this podcast about bringing your own baggage to media. And when you're going into an adaptation, it's totally an experience in bringing your baggage because you've got the full story and you've got all of these, character connections and things that you're bringing already with you into whatever medium you're going. So I had all that stuff with me, so it didn't bother me. I was like, cool, that was great. I enjoyed it,
Right. I got to see all my moments.
Right. I got to see, right. But for somebody who's walking in blind, or for somebody who's walking in without the original material, that probably isn't the experience that they've had. So
yeah, and I feel like that's a similar. Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack with this, and I'll just bring up all the heavy hitters with Harry Potter and the Harry Potter adaptation.
Inevitably,
that got me thinking about when you were talking about Hunger Games, because I feel like there are a lot of things to complain about with the Harry Potter adaptations, and I get that. But I think one thing that people do kind of really miss about the adaptations is all those small moments in the Harry Potter books that you don't get because there's just not enough time. I mean, there are obviously drastic changes made to the adaptation, so I'm not referencing those, but some of the earlier films even that were more spot on, that followed the main plot points. Yes, you changed some things about this character said this thing when it should have been this one and whatever, and his eyes aren't the same color and everything like that. But there were those elements of, you don't get those small little moments with these side characters, with these magical occurrences, with all these things that you get in the books. And I'm realizing this now because I'm rereading the series for the first time ever, very slowly, like one book a year at this point, but I am doing it. But I have so much experience with the movies, and I'm seeing like all of these things that were missed in the movies. The main plot points were still there. I still get the gist of it. I still know what's going to happen when I'm reading the books and remembering the movies, but I don't get those small little things that I think made the world so rich and so fun for people, because it's missing those things in favor of just strictly kind of following the main plot points.
This goes back, I think, to bringing your baggage to media as well, because I watched all of the movies of Harry Potter first before I read it as an adult. And so that's kind of the baggage that I brought to the books. I had already seen and enjoyed the movies. I had no quibbles with them along those lines because I didn't know where it was being adapted from. And so when I finally got to the books, it was more like bonus material for me. I was like, all right, look at all this extra stuff we got going on. So I have no complaints along those lines with the Harry Potter movies, and I love them because they were how I was introduced into the world. And I think that whenever you talk about adaptations, you just have to acknowledge that those kinds of things exist. And even the baggage of like, I prefer TV shows and books to movies. So any time that something I love is being adapted into the movie, I'm less excited than if you tell me it's going to be like a miniseries. It's a miniseries, I'm on board. It's a movie, I'm more hesitant. So I think you have to acknowledge that stuff.
I had the same experience of Harry Potter, like everything you just said about Harry Potter +1, saw the movies first, and similarly reading the books was just like, oh wow, bonus material with all these characters. That's fun. To the point about miniseries versus movie, I cannot complete this conversation without bringing up Golden Compass, which I watched yesterday specifically to prepare for this conversation because I had never seen it. I love these books. I read the books for the first time when I was like in the year after I graduated from college, but have since I do like a full reread almost once a year because I love them so much. And that movie was a disaster, but I'm like very, very excited about the miniseries.
Yes.
So like I'm like very hopeful. I'm like, okay, yes, miniseries, you can have more time. But that movie, I spent the whole time trying so hard to make sense out of the choices that they were making. I specifically watched this movie because for this conversation, because I am generally someone who was like very forgiving of adaptations, changing things. And I was like, okay, this is one that's like going to necessarily be hard for me because I am way more attached to that source material than I am with a lot of other things. And also like because I have heard so many I just never watched it because I heard bad things about it. Like I just didn't, it was like, okay, well, whatever. Like by the time I read the books, the movie had already come out and everybody I know by and large who read the books was like, no, this is not a good adaptation. And so I went into it with all of that baggage. But like at no point could I make sense out of the changes that they were making beyond like either there were some places where they were clearly making changes in an effort to sanitize it, which I get it. That I get. But beyond that, they made a bunch of changes that were just geared towards big, flashy visuals. Like we're moving, like the ending, they shuffled the whole ending around specifically because they decided that they wanted to end on like Lyra sailing away in the boat, or in the balloon. I mean, that was what they decided. Like, yeah, this is going to be a good, big, dramatic ending. If Lyra and the bear and the witch and everybody is sailing, flying away in the balloon. And like, they just kept making all of these absurd choices that were clearly geared towards, we want to have a cool visual, which is very frustrating because it was so well cast and they like all of the CG decisions, like it was very beautiful, but oof. Bad script. Really bad script. And they begin by explaining all of this stuff that like you spend the whole book learning about the way the world works. Like the book has a very, very slow start. Like it takes a lot of people like their first introduction to the book is that the first 100 or so pages are like a struggle. And like that's, because like but part of that is that you don't really know like entirely what's going on. Like I think that one of the things that the books are very effective at doing is showing you the world and you learn about the world largely through interactions and through things that make sense make sense given that everybody there already has this prior knowledge that you don't have. And the movie begins with this very aggressive info dump about like there are other worlds, which like every conversation in the movie is info dumpy. Is like this is not a natural conversation that two people would be having. We are clearly having this conversation to tell the audience something in this way that's just like yikes. Yikes, man.
I'm going to take a gamble here and just guess that that's one of the worst adaptations you've seen.
Oh, yeah. We're going to move into worst, our worst of list.
I don't know. You brought that one up, and it sounded like it was the worst for you.
Yeah. Well, it's the freshest. It's probably part of why I can have like a whole hour-long conversation about this stupid fucking movie that I just wasted 2 hours of my Saturday on. Yeah. So, what are everybody else's worst of?
I think for me, one of the worst adaptations that I ever saw, I saw The Golden Compass. It was on my list as well. And I read the books because they are your favorite. So I went into them like ready to enjoy, which I did. I enjoyed all three. I think I had a similar issue with the books that you had with A Wrinkle in Time, in that at portions I felt like I was being preached at, but it didn't affect my enjoyment of the story as much because I love Lyra and Will. I love them so much, and so passionately. So those are books that I loved. And then afterwards, I was so happy to watch the movie. I was like, that movie's waiting for me. And then that movie killed all my hopes and dreams. So it was very bad. It was very bad. And the changes that it made, and again, I understand that this is not a valid, always criticism of an adaptation, but I felt like the changes that they made fundamentally changed the story in ways that I did not understand. So it was not a fun adaptation for me to watch. I had a similar experience with Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I watched the entire animated series and I loved the shit out of it. And I knew I watched them after they had aired, so I knew that the movie was waiting for me as well. Everybody told me, don't do it. I did it anyways. And it was not a good choice. From just kind of the criticism right off the bat that it was whitewashed, which it was. That was awful. But also just the storytelling, the decisions that it made, and the fact that you're taking this animated series that has 60-some episodes and translating into under 2-hour movie. And the decisions that it made did not do that effectively. So that's one of the worst that I watched. And I'll just end by mentioning every single adaptation of the Mortal Instruments I've ever seen. And they keep giving it chances, and they're like, no, we're going to adapt it this way, but it's not working, and they just keep trying. So good for Cassandra Clare, bad for anybody who has to watch them.
Very true. My brain does this really great protective thing for me where it forgets things that I hate a lot unless I really...
Where can I get that?
With adaptations with visual media, I remember books I hate a lot, but with stuff that I've wasted my time on watching, a couple hours of TV or movie, my brain is like, you don't need that anymore, blip, and it gets rid of it. So I'm having a very hard time thinking of them. But the one, and these are all kind of the classic ones. I remember Aragon being really bad, but the thing is I had so much distance from it, so I really haven't watched a lot of recently bad adaptations right after the source material. So I read Aragon back in, grade school, middle school. I don't remember exactly the timeline. And then the movie didn't come out until probably 4, 5, 6 years later, whatever it ended up being. I mean, it was a long time between. So while I sat there recognizing this is bad, I didn't have such a deep commitment to it. I hadn't read on in the series. I'd only read I think the first 2 books. So I didn't have this emotional investment that so many fans did of it, but I still recognize that it was bad. For another example, which again, I hadn't even read the books yet, was the Percy Jackson movies. I went to see that to be oh, is this something I want to, partake in? Is this a series I want to read? And then I was like, oh, no, it's not. But I didn't know that they were actually pretty decent because at the time I didn't have the book community or anything online to go and be like, hey, what's the deal with this? This is really shitty. So those kind of things. But I've had such distance from a lot of the bad adaptations that I don't feel them in my bones as much as you guys are feeling yours.
Yeah. The watching it yesterday thing versus watching years ago definitely makes a big difference in the degree of attachment to this terrible thing that was done to me by a movie.
Oh, I just remembered one. Okay, wow, thank you, brain. So one that we kind of haven't touched on, or like the genre we haven't quite touched on yet, is kind of like the contemporary genre of stuff getting adapted. And the one that I remember really disliking was If I Stay by Gail Forman. So I really liked If I Stay, the book. I think I listened to it on audio, and I really appreciated that the book didn't really focus so much on the main character's romantic relationship. I mean, it was definitely a thing, but it wasn't her driving thing. Her driving thing, and the thing that was keeping her kind of moored to life, because she was in a car accident and she's between life and death, kind of, and am I going to stay or not kind of thing. And the whole thing was her family, the love of her family, and the love of music, and her violin. I believe she's a violin or cello or something player. And the movie changed that to being all about the love of her boyfriend and like all of this stuff. And even the very end of it, which again, spoilers, but the very end is he brings her back by a song that he wrote her, but it's still him bringing her back. And in the book, she starts hearing like cello music or whatever, and her love of her cello brings her back in spite of everything. And they completely changed the whole point of the story by making it about this romantic love thing. So that's the most recent one that I can remember being like angry about.
And that's one that's just like super gross too, because it is this story about a like teenage girl to take a story that is otherwise about, finding this like deep and personal sense of purpose in life, that like, her immediate family is all dead and it's, tragic. I also, yes, like +1, same, loved the book, was not a huge fan of the choices that they made in the adaptation. And it's just like frustrating and gross to take that sense of this teenage girl finding a very profound sense of personal purpose to turn that into her sense of purpose is a boy. Like what the fuck?
Exactly.
When you were talking about that, the other thing that jumped out at me was Before I Fall, which like the book is not like groundbreaking great, but was one that I really enjoyed. And I watched the movie, I had many years of distance between reading the book and when I finally watched the movie, but I watched the movie on a plane a couple months ago and was just like very disappointed. I was like, and I don't know, maybe some of this is that I have enough distance from the book that it's worse than I remember, which I allow as a possibility here. But the movie was just like very underwhelming. Like there was just nothing that I think like I got some measure of enjoyment out of it because I liked the book, and there was a little bit of like, oh yeah, it's all these characters again, like that like memory trigger, but like as a movie was just not good.
I've made the active decision not to watch that movie because I also enjoyed Before I Fall when I first read it in probably like 2012, but I also will not reread the book. I thought I was going to for a while, but I have the feeling that I enjoyed it at that time of my life, and that if I read it or watched the movie now, it would ruin that experience.
Yeah,
I'm just not gonna. We'll leave it in 2012 and move along.
Right.
It's sort of a transition to better things. I'm going to talk about some adaptations that I was thinking about that probably I don't think about as often, but as I was preparing, I was like, oh, these are a thing. And I think when it goes in the direction of being adapted towards movies, I could only think of bad examples. So these are video games to movie adaptations. So we have things like, Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. I'm sorry, Sweeney, but those are bad movies. And
I know they're bad movies.
And then like the Super Mario Brothers movie is also a very bad movie. Yeah. But
there's a really great Real Bad episode about that movie that I highly recommend everyone check out.
In the good direction, though, I think one of my favorite adaptations are the Witcher books that got adapted into video games, which are some of my favorite I've been playing Witcher 3. I'm almost done with that one. So that's the only one I've been playing. But after I got like halfway through the game, I decided I wanted to go back and read the books. And I've been very much enjoying the books, even though it's got some problematic like 90s fantasy version of women in there, I will say as a warning, but the characters, the world building, Geralt and Ciri are some of my favorite characters. And then just kind of reading it and experience the world in that order, you can really see how much they took the best of that world and put it into the video games, and how much of the character you get a feel for in the video game. I just think it's so well done. And it's just a good game, like on its own. So that's probably one of my favorite adaptations. And it's one, like I said, that I don't really think about often, but that comes from the video game world.
Yeah, that's one that I didn't even think of as an adaptation, because I think much like Fight Club, it's kind of surpassed its original media.
Yes.
I know that the books are really, really popular in Poland because it's a Polish author, but it's not so much over here. It's not so well known. And though those games are masterpieces. Like, they're just stunning in every way.
Beautiful, yeah.
And it really does unfold like a book almost. I mean, that's a game that I recommend a lot of book fans, because it does feel so rich in that way. And it's a really good way at like beginner getting into game, because it doesn't need to be super difficult if you don't want it to be. And that is one that is just like, oh yeah, this is actually based on something else, but it's so beautiful on its own. So I have such happy feelings that you just mentioned The Witcher.
I know. I was playing the games. I'm not a big gamer. I mean, mostly because of like time, and also I suck at platform games and shooting games. Like, I'm just not good at them. But like open world games and things like that, like I can do a little bit better. And part of the reason that it's taken me so long is that I got through it. I'm like, no wait, I like this world and I love these characters. I need to read the books. Like, it was so the story was so well done that I just knew I needed more. So I paused and I started reading the books. And I've reread the first 3 books, I think 3 times each or 2 times each now. So yeah.
And haven't finished the game.
I know. I haven't finished the game. I haven't finished the series, but I'm like, you know what? I should read book 1 again. Seems like a legit decision. So.
Priorities.
Yeah.
One of my favorite adaptations, while we are talking about other media besides adaptations into movies, is the Lizzie Bennet Diaries.
Oh.
I feel like is a necessary one to throw out there for effective adaptations. Actually, also Pride and Prejudice, but on the subject of movies, I really, really enjoy the Keira Knightley version. I know a lot of people don't like it.
No, same though.
Because it's not like, you don't get everything like with BBC, but it's so beautiful. When that movie came out on DVD, I was a senior in high school, and there was like a solid 2 months where I came home from school every day that I didn't work. I came home from school and watched, put the DVD on while I was doing my homework or whatever, every single day, which is wild to me because of the way that I consume media now. I cannot comprehend being that person anymore. The list of things that I want to get to is so long that I do not go back to things that I love as much as I would probably like to. So the fact that I was watching the same movie every day for 2 months is I don't even know who that person was, but I love that movie. It's beautiful. The music is wonderful. But also the Lizzie Bennet Diaries it just makes my whole heart so happy. It's so good. Although I rewatched it recently. A couple months ago, I went back to the beginning and watched it. And there were some things about it that I remember jumping out at me when I was watching it the first time, but this time were even more pronounced just in light of all sorts of things surrounding YouTube culture. So all 3 of us make YouTube videos. So this is, whatever. But there are a couple moments in the story where I'm like, oh my God, Lizzie, you cannot do that. This is very invasive of the privacy of everyone around you. These are not your stories to tell to the internet. What are you doing? So there's some stuff like that where you have to, suspend a fair amount of disbelief to accept her. But I love it anyway. It's beautiful.
I'm the exact opposite of Nicole in that I rewatch and reread the shit out of the things that I love. Obviously, we just talked about how I don't finish things just so I can go back and experience things again. And Pride and Prejudice is one of my favorite books of all time. I've been reading it since my freshman year of high school, and I probably read it once a year. So it is a story that I absolutely love, and I go back to it for comfort, and I love the adaptations of it. So for a while there, I was a 1995 BBC mini-series snob. It still is my favorite. It still is my favorite, just because, again, the human part of me just knows that it has the room to adapt everything that I love. It has the dialogue. I mean, it's very on the nose. It has all of the dialogue, all of the scenes that I love, and it's just very faithful to the source material, which is material that I love. But when I get sick, this is the media that I consume. It's like my chicken soup. So I will watch the miniseries, and then I'll put on the Keira Knightley version, and there even I think, gosh, it was early 90s or maybe late 80s that there was another version that was on Netflix for a time, and I forget what the name of the main actor that's in it, but nobody likes it. I will watch that one as well. Like, nobody says that one is their favorite, but I'll watch it too. But anyways, the last time that I was sick with a flu, I watched the Keira Knightley version, and I found such a new appreciation for it, because I think it does some very smart things in what it can with its time limits. And I think one of the things that it does the best is show you on screen some of these relationships in a way that the story doesn't and the miniseries don't, because it's so on the nose. So you kind of, one of the scenes that just comes up to the top of my head is you have Lizzie and Jane in bed, and she's just met Bingley, and she's telling him, he's handsome and rich like a man ought to be. And then she gets so excited that she kind of squeals and starts kicking around her legs under the covers, and Lizzie squealing with her. And it's just such a moment where all you get is their connection as sisters, and you don't have those moments in the BBC version. And so I just started appreciating it for those liberties that it took in order to show us connections in a space that it had, what it had to work with. So it's a great adaptation. And for the Lizzie Bennett Diaries, I think what I found most fascinating was how it modernized. So we haven't really talked about modernizations as adaptations, but that's one that I think made some interesting and smart decisions.
Yeah, taking Lydia's scandal, all of the subtle ways that they tweaked the story to say okay, what is the contemporary version of all of these things was very good and clever and clearly very thoughtful, which I liked. And this goes back to, I think, a running theme of this whole conversation, right? Is how much thought and care is being put into recreating these stories.
Yeah. And I definitely, when you're both talking, I just was nodding, yes, I feel both of these things immensely, because I like Nicole, do not rewatch and reread and re-consume a lot of things. I just don't. But when I first got the Pride and Prejudice 2005 DVD, I watched it 3 times in a row on the same day, which is extreme. And I do find that I find classic lit, whether it's a modern adaptation or a more on the nose adaptation, I find that to be very comforting as well. So like Madi was saying, I will rewatch those kinds of things more than once, just over and over if I'm not feeling well. And I do that with Pride and Prejudice, but I also do that with those kind of modern adaptations. I really like what they were doing, and I wish that I forget who was doing them, but I wish they would keep doing them, because I loved Emma Approved, and I loved Lizzie Bennett Diaries, and I even was watching Carmilla, which is Carmilla, I forget which one, how to even pronounce it now that I'm saying it out loud, which was a wholly different team was doing that. But I really like those modern adaptations that they were doing via YouTubing. And again, is that because I'm kind of in this YouTube space and it just hits so much closer to home? Maybe, but I just really appreciate that. And they are allowed to kind of take those liberties, which make it a different kind of twist on it. And it's, you have all these adaptations with these classic literature that's been around for so long that you have all of these adaptations, and they're all fairly similar. Obviously, they follow the same plot points. So you can only really do it so much in theory, even though we keep doing it. So maybe that's not so true. But I love those modern takes on it, because it just feels so much closer to home. And I think it gets people more interested in this classic literature that they probably wouldn't even come near because it's so intimidating. But you put a modern twist on it, and all of a sudden everyone really loves it, and they're more willing to try it and get into it. So I think both of those, whether it's modern or just the classic adaptation of classic literature, is just so comforting in so many ways.
Well, it can make you more excited. I remember reading Taming of the Shrew when I was in high school and being furious and being well, clearly 10 Things I Hate About You is it changed it, modernized it, but also made the substantive change to the story that made it acceptable to me. Getting to the end of Taming of the Shrew, I was what the fuck is this? This is terrible. Why are we reading this?
While Sam was talking, I was definitely thinking about 10 Things I Hate About You, and also Clueless as an adaptation, which is also, I think, just smart. And it's weird to call them adaptations because it changes so much, and it really just uses a source material as a jumping off point. but in the times that it crosses over and you can see where those inspirations come for, it's so fulfilling to be like, I see how you adopted that thing and, you know, how you changed it and how you made it fit. So I think that's really cool as well. And I think those are two that are probably a lot of people have seen them and maybe not consumed the source material, which is funny because they're like classics and things that, you know, people like learn. I've never read Emma, and I love Jane Austen and I read a lot of her work. I've never read Emma. I've seen Clueless like a gazillion times. So
yeah, funny confessional, but I watched Clueless, you know, many, many times, and it wasn't until I watched Emma Approved that I realized that Clueless was an Emma adaptation, and I felt so stupid. And I posted about it on Facebook back when posting on Facebook was a thing for me, and my English teacher from back then like laughed from high school and was like, ha ha ha, that's so funny. So yeah, that was a very actually recent in the grand scheme of my life realization that I'm slightly ashamed of.
So like, what was it about Emma Approved that like tipped it off for you? Were you like that this was familiar?
I think it was the plot line with the friend, and I'm forgetting people's names because I'm atrocious with remembering character names, but the plot line with the friend, and I was like, wait, this is Clueless. Like I had a moment. I was well into my 20s. I was in my mid 20s, and I was like, oh no, I feel so foolish. Like I had a BookTube channel. I think I might have even tweeted about it. I don't know, but I was very ashamed as a book person. And
That's
great. Granted, I had never read Emma, so it really technically isn't my fault, but I still felt very stupid.
Yeah. That's funny. That's fantastic.
Now that we've talked about our favorite and least favorite adaptations, I thought it would be fun to end talking a little bit about forthcoming adaptations that we are excited about. So these are things that have been announced, not necessarily only optioned, but things we know will be released in the nearish future. So what would that be for you, Sam?
I have a few that are kind of still vaguely in the works. So I already mentioned the Shatter Me adaptation. I think that's going to be fun, hopefully, fingers crossed, and not a disappointment. I also feel that and I think this has been just announced and not just optioned, the Raven Boys series is supposed to be adapted, and I think officially. And I just finished reading that series, and I think that if they make really appropriate atmospheric decisions, because that's what matters in the case of that series for me, that it's going to be beautiful and wonderful, and I'm going to be very, very happy. And also the Name of the Wind, although I'm still very skeptical about that one because it's the Name of the Wind, but it's not. And like, what are we doing? Yeah. But that one I'm excited about as well.
This is a total cheat, but I am excited about A Wrinkle in Time, which we're going to see. I mean, truly, I said this on the episode about the book, but I only wanted to read the book because I watched the trailer for that movie and was like, holy shit, this looks amazing. And like was so excited about this movie that I was like, yeah, okay, I guess I'll read the book first. So I'm very excited about that. I think it's going to be rad. I am also excited about, I mentioned this already, but the Golden Compass BBC miniseries that is like finally, apparently movement is happening. They've been talking about this for fucking ever. But while I was watching Golden Compass, I was looking it up like, it's like, what is going on? Is something finally happening? And apparently they're like finalizing cast now. So hopefully we'll get cast announcements at some point in the next few weeks, which would be wonderful. The other one, I don't know, this is like a weird adaptation since I have my only affinity for it is actually like the Melissa Joan Hart show TV series, but the Sabrina the Teenage Witch that is coming out soon, that I'm very excited about because it's plucked from the like Riverdale universe, but it's going to be set in I think the 60s, and it's going to have sort of the same like spoopy dark vibe as Riverdale, probably darker because it's going to be on Netflix, so rather than the CW. And I was reading about the comic storyline. I could just actually read the comics, but I was reading on Wikipedia about like the comic storyline that it's drawing from, and it's got a bunch of like weird Lovecraftian stuff happening. So I think that is going to be super cool, and I'm excited.
I didn't even know that was happening. Now I'm like, ooh.
I didn't know about that, but now I'm excited.
Right.
Yeah.
I will +1 the Name of the Wind stuff, and also being kind of nervous about it because I don't know that it will be an adaptation. I think what we're getting is a prequel or something set in that world. But, man, I really am enjoying that world, so I'm tentatively excited about that and about the Golden Compass miniseries. I will add something that I know Sam didn't enjoy very much, but I'm super excited to see how they adapt The Knife of Never Letting Go, or the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness, which I really love those characters. They've made interesting casting choices. They've aged up the characters, which is interesting to me because it's a coming of age story, and the entire story kind of hinges on this one character becoming a man, and now he's like obviously a grown man. So I don't know how that's going to go, but Patrick Ness, I think, has some say over the screenwriting, if I'm remembering correctly, and he's done some really great and amazing things. So I'm excited about that. I am also excited about, and this is, again, tentatively excited, because I've heard it's already out overseas, and I've heard mixed things, and also J.K. Rowling has been kind of a jerk on social media lately, and she's said some things that makes me like retroactively feel differently about her work. But she has her mystery novels. The Cormoran Strike novels are getting an adaptation miniseries, and they'll be released in the States, I think, this summer. So I'm excited to watch those as well. And the other thing, which I don't think we'll see for a while because I think they're, again, being released overseas first and then coming to the U.S., is based on Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend. It's the Neapolitan novels. It's a quartet, and they are brilliant stories, amazing storytelling. It's like it's soap opera-y, but it's beautifully written, and it's got these characters you love to hate. And I was just consumed with all 4 books when I read them the first time, I think 1.5 years or 2 years ago. And I'm so excited about it coming to screen. And I think they're going to be in Italian, and I think it's going to be very authentic and beautiful. And I know that's very hopeful, but I'm excited. I'm so excited about that coming to a miniseries, which is my chosen format we already talked about. So those are my 3.
Cool. On that note, I think we are ready to wrap this up and call it a day for this conversation on adaptations. You can find us at SnarkSquad.com, where we will have a post where you can talk to us about this episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and join us in the Discord and let us know your thoughts there. Or you can find us on Twitter at @snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Marines.
And you can find me at Thoughts on Tomes.
Thank you to Sam for joining us this week, and thank you to Stefan Chin for our fancy theme music. And I believe you will hear us next week talking about A Wrinkle in Time, the movie. I'm not looking at the calendar, so I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's it. Regardless, we will be back in your ears next week.
Bye.
Bye.